Okay, welcome everybody to another edition of the PHYA Academy video newsletter. Today's lesson is on masculinity. So I like to start out these lessons by coming to terms with a definition or some sort of a common understanding of what we're going to be talking about, so we're not all off on different things. So when we're thinking about masculinity, we just flip over to the dictionary definition and it tells us to consult what is masculine. And what is masculine is having qualities appropriate to or usually associated with a man. Okay, so masculinity just simply means, like, at its most base, manly characteristics, right? The character traits that are historically associated with men. Now, when we look back in history, historically, the character traits that have been defined as masculine are related to physical strength and leadership qualities. Right, those are kind of the two components that we'll find sort of across all cultures in all time periods. Um, Now, there's a good biological reason for this. It's based on evolution, anthropological evolution in a hunter-gatherer society, right, where we have men who go out and hunt, women who stay back to take care of the children, but also to gather to gather food and basically organize and run the society in a sense. So men have been relied upon for different things throughout our evolution, and this has led to not necessarily like a natural inclination, but certainly a division between the sexes. And we often hear about the distinction between, sex and gender, and that sex is gender, or that gender and sex are different. And I don't want to wade into that controversy here. What I will say is that different cultures will express what it means to be a man and a woman differently, and this can often be confusing when it comes to the idea of gender, right? That gender is expressed differently, and we have different understandings of what it means to be masculine and feminine. But the important thing to note is all cultures have an understanding of what is masculine and what is feminine. So maybe that does give us some sort of a biological understanding that our different compositions lead us to act in different ways and thus to be praised for different things in society. Now, sport, with its focus on physical strength and leadership, lives in the realm of the masculine, and it exists and emerged out of those domains that existed to train men. So, in particular, the military, and as we'll talk about in just a second, all of the different institutions of ancient Greece, right? Because ancient Greece, classical Greece, this is where sport emerged from. And I've got a few Aristotle quotes in this presentation because I personally love Aristotle. I really am swayed by his arguments, you could say. And he had a thing or two to say about masculinity and its role, and in particular, its role in socializing young boys when it comes to sport. So, Aristotle says physical education is important because it contributes to manliness. So, it's clear then that sport in its genesis was related to the acquisition of masculine virtues. Now, why is this interesting in terms of history? Well, the ancient Greek ideal of the athlete is actually a much more encompassing, it's a much more holistic idea. It's not just the athlete. The ancient Greek ideal when it comes to masculinity or manliness, or what it means to be a man, has its roots in this notion of the free citizen. So now we're talking about classical Greece, the era of the democracy, roughly speaking, the years, around 800 to 300 or so BCE. It's a very rough guess, but that's the sort of 500-year period that we're talking about here. And it's during this historical period that a lot of evolution occurs in the Greek polity, and we end up at a sort of a state where the free citizen basically exemplifies all of the important roles or hats or duties or obligations or responsibilities that men hold in Greek society. So the ancient Greek free citizen is basically gets their freedom from sacrifice in battle, right? So you are able to serve, you're able to afford your own armor, thereby sacrificing yourself in service of the community. And one of the really big things that you'll notice about all of this is the Greek ideal of masculinity is service of the community, is in service of the community, pardon me, but realized through the individual's agency. So it's a really nice balance, right, between individual and collective. But you get your rights to vote, you get your rights to serve as a politician from being a soldier, and you accrue your wealth by being a farmer. And the soldier is the politician, is the farmer, but it's also the athlete. So what we're starting to see is that in the ancient Greek ideal, the classical Greek ideal, that masculinity is defined by responsibility and obligation. And when we're talking about the athlete's role in Greek society was to educate and inspire everybody on the most excellent virtues, right? It was through athletic competition that one best revealed their character. And so having physical education, having sports as a masculine activity really does highlight this notion of obligation, sacrifice, hardship, and links it up with those traditional masculine ideals. And what we sort of get from this idea, the ancient Greek idea of, athletic masculinity, is that the best men exude the best qualities of citizenship. And this is why it was important for the athlete to not just be a physical specimen, but to be intellectually sharp and to be morally sound. And we're trying to think, of an example from the 20th century of an athlete who might fit this mold maybe better than most. The athlete that pops directly into my mind is Sir Roger Bannister. He is an exemplary model of the ancient Greek ideal of masculinity that we can look to kind of in our own time and provide us maybe with a model of what we think masculinity should be, especially through an athletic context. So, for those of you who don't know, Roger Bannister is the first person in world history to break the 4 minute mile, or at least to be recorded breaking the 4 minute mile. He did this in 1954. Now, what is truly astonishing about Roger Bannister is he was not a professional track athlete. He was about as amateur gets. I mean, he was excellent. He broke the 50, I believe it was the 1500-meter record at the 1952 Helsinki Olympics. He broke the British record, and this kind of inspired him to go for the 4 minute mile. But he didn't train solely to do that. He was at the time in 1954 when he broke the 4 minute mile. He was training actually as a junior doctor on the way to becoming a neurosurgeon. So he wasn't chasing the record. It wasn't the only thing he was doing. Like, he was training to break it, but it wasn't something he was spending hours and hours and hours a day on because he had all these other responsibilities. Masculinity in service of the community with greater obligations and responsibilities, right? And he gives us this sense, right, that the ideal of the athlete is the complete man in body and mind and spirit, right? It's clear in body he is, a world beater, a record breaker. But he's also somebody with incredible intelligence and incredible dedication to developing his mind, obviously training as a medical doctor and then going into an even more difficult field of neuroscience and actually neurosurgery. And when we think about sort of like moral character and moral quality, when he looks back on his life, and again, he's been knighted, right? He's Sir Roger Bannister for all of the different things that he's done. So he's being recognized and celebrated, right? Being knighted by the Queen. But he's most proud of his research into the into the nervous system, and to his contributions, his academic contributions to medical science and to like the treating of patients. The athletic feats were more of an expression of himself rather than like what he defined himself as. But it also gives us a sense of the importance of his athletic feats, because if he was just a neurosurgeon, would we know about him? Of course not. his athletic feats inspire us to follow him into greatness, and not just to become superhumans in terms of our physical qualities, but to emulate his model as this complete man, the one who was strong in body, sharp in mind, and clear in mental focus, clear in moral certainty. Pardon me. And this is the kind of best. This is the mark of a man who possesses the best kinds of masculinity, right? Because there are positive masculine qualities and there are negative masculine qualities, and you can see those consistently being played out in the world of sport. But we want to think about sport as this place of the best, right? Where we bring out the best in ourselves. And since it's historically been linked to training and promoting and providing the best male citizens of a society, we should really take seriously this notion that athletics instructs us into the positive masculine characteristics. And what's really neat is we can zoom back into to the ancient Greek world for a second, and look at how masculinity in competition, right, was utilized. Specifically, competition in war, but also competition, obviously, in athletics. And there's this time period where everything kind of like comes together, and there's always this kind of a mythology in certain in all cultures, this notion of a golden age, right? That the men were better then than they are now. And you can get to that sort of the trope, that strong men create good times create weak men create bad time or hard times create strong men, right? And it plays over and over and over again. And there's some truth to that. But there's also truth to the notion that we oftentimes look back with rose-colored glasses as well. And the Greeks were doing this too. And the ancient Greek poet Pindar is famous. He's the most famous of all the ancient Greek poets. You can see that he lived right in this nice sweet spot in the classical Greek history, 518 to 438 BC. And he was the one that wrote the greatest praise poems of the Olympic champions. And the generation of champions that he described were known as the golden age of athletes. And there was a consistent theme throughout Pindar's poems linking these athletes to a notion of leadership, right? And we know that masculinity, the traditional sort of founts of masculinity, are physical strength and calls to leadership. So he used the term eidos, an ancient Greek term eidos, which essentially means just and rightful authority. So it's not just power, right? The ability to make somebody do what they don't want to do. It is power in the sense of legitimacy, that it is rightfully earned and dispensed justly. And the major sort of components of eidos is this notion of strength and empathy, right? So obviously physical strength, courage, valor, determination, dedication, those types of qualities, but empathy. And in particular, a kind of empathy towards the weak, right? That we don't bully, we don't push around, we don't abuse authority. We provide protection for the weak, in a sense. That's what the strong are supposed to do. That's the moral use of strength. And it's very fitting that this is the golden age. Like these are the best citizens ever produced by the ancient Greek city-states. To give you a historical benchmark, these are the men who defeated the Persian invasion, right? So the famous battles of Plataea, Marathon, the 300 at the gates of Thermopylae, the Battle of Salamis for military historians out there. But you've got these collection of, free city-states and their soldiers defending against the largest military empire the world had ever seen. Creates a kind of a mythology, right, within Greece about the kind of people who were able to do this. And so it's no surprise that the soldiers who fought and the politicians who led were also the athletes who were mythologized more than any other athletes. And we can see this idea played out by Aristotle, right? Aristotle lives a few hundred years after Pindar, after the time of the golden age of these Greek athletes. And here he's talking about this notion of here's what happens when you just focus on the physical. Like it's not enough. It's not the right ideal of the athlete. It's not the best qualities of manliness and masculinity. So this gives us the idea, right, that brute strength alone and domination alone is not what the ancient Greeks want when they're talking about masculinity. So Aristotle says, to those who train their children in athletics to the exclusion of other necessities, make their children truly vulgar and available to the state for only one kind of work, and actually train them worse for this one job than others do. Yikes. That is not a very good picture that Aristotle paints of what happens when we neglect one element of the genuine masculine ideal in terms of body and mind together. If you neglect the mind, well, then you're actually apt to be manipulated and used for nefarious reasons. Doesn't matter how strong in body you are. Similarly, if you're strong in mind and you don't train your body, you can be misused in another direction. And what's neat to note about this time is Aristotle, while he praises athletics, he demonizes the athletes because at this time they've become specialists, they've become professionals. All they do is train, and they don't even bother training in different events. They just train in the one event so that they could win, that they could break a record, and that they could achieve fame and glory. But at this time, it's seen as hollow. It's seen as a hollow fame and glory. And the athletes that sort of win at this time period in Greek history are not mythologized as heroes, they just simply exist. Right, so what does that mean? And why is encouraging masculinity important today? Well, again, if we're thinking about adapting this ancient wisdom for our own practical utility, what it means is that neglecting body or neglecting mind or neglecting soul, you got two of three, not enough. You got one of three, it's certainly not enough. It's all three together. It's all three together. It's the body, it's the mind, it's the spirit, it's all working together as one. That's the ideal man. That's the ideal citizen. That's the ideal leader. And so encouraging masculinity becomes important, again, in the sense of Aristotle's notion of morality. For Aristotle, we have to uncover the nature of whatever activity we're engaged in and then aim directly towards it with internal motivation. And we do this in order to become the best version of ourselves. Well, as men, we cannot become the best version of ourselves by denying our nature. We cannot simply say masculinity doesn't exist or there is no distinction between the way men and women act. This does not mean that individuals shouldn't be allowed to express themselves, or if we have extremely feminine men or extremely masculine women that they can't express themselves. I don't believe that's true, and I actually think that's wrong. But that doesn't mean we can deny that there is a general distinction and the difference between men and women, and that men gravitate towards certain things and women gravitate towards other things, generally speaking. So in order for us to become the best men that we can be, what we have to understand first is that masculinity is important. We should aim to cultivate it. Otherwise, we're, in a sense, lying to ourselves. But we should understand that it's expressed differently in different cultures. And this is related to time and context and all the sort of things that make, people different from each other in different times and places. But what we need to do is adapt it for a time. We have to take the essence of the lessons and we have to understand how to apply it today. So in some sense, right, when we're thinking about masculinity, it's like what we want to do is leave behind like the locker room bully, like the dumb jock. Like we don't want the athlete who thinks that they're better than the other person because they're physically stronger. And we don't want the person to think, we don't want the athlete to think that it's not important to cultivate your mind because you're strong in body. We don't want the bully, we don't want the dumb jock, and we don't want the stifling conformity either. But what we do want are some of those traditional elements of masculinity, like the emphasis on physical courage, for example, the ability to take pride in physical strength while not solely forming our identities based on that. And then this notion of gentle authority, we should say, right? That those who have authority have it rightfully, but they also have the responsibility to dispense it justly. And I think that's what the notion of eidos tells us. That's what the ancient ideals about the best kind of a man in terms of the soldier, the athlete, the farmer, the politician, although politicians aren't really that honorable these days. Um, Thinking about a person like Sir Roger Bannister as an exemplary model of the kind of masculinity that both respects the ancient ideals, but then also can be translated into a modern adaptation. This is how we can think about ourselves with respect to this ancient wisdom. All right, love talking with you guys, and I'll see you for the next lesson.